This video is sponsored by Bespoke Post.
This is what's called an elevator table. It's a Danish modern design that up until this point I've only seen photos of, and I've always wanted to build one. I wasn't able to find any measurements or any plans, but I worked out how to make one, and I'm going to show you how.
Because of the complexity of this piece of furniture, I decided to build a scale model. I don't do this, actually I've never done this before for any other piece of furniture, but there's something about this project that just made me feel like I needed to get a hands-on approach to designing it. I usually design in 3D software, but having like actual gravity holding these parts together and being able to move them and manipulate them, I felt like this was the best way to go. This model is 1/3 scale, which is done because I have 1/4 inch plywood and I have 3/4 inch plywood. So it makes the math really pretty easy to scale up from 1/4 inch to 3/4 inch. And if there's one thing I like, it's keeping the math easy. This is a technique that somebody told me about when I was doing the shed build, and I figured I'd give it a shot. Apparently you can just chuck up a nail into a drill and use it as your drill bit, and it drills a perfectly sized hole. Who knew? These pieces are the lifting arms for the table, and I'm trying to dial in the height perfectly so that it actually fits inside of the table, but gets me the height that I need. I really want the table to be about 29 to 30 inches tall when it's open, and then when it's closed, all the way down to 18 inches. The best way that I could figure out how to make the tracks is by drilling out a whole bunch of holes using a box cutter to score the plywood and then going over that scored cut with a chisel. It worked well, but it was very time consuming. I cut out another piece of 1/4 inch plywood, and this is going to be essentially the apron. This actually isn't the final piece, but I just wanted to see how this would move once it was all assembled. And it was moving pretty well, actually. I was kind of surprised because those tracks were pretty rough on the inside, but you could kind of get a feel of how it was going to work. And I felt confident enough to start building the cross supports and sort of turn this into an actual 3D model. That big chunk of metal that I'm using to keep everything square is a really inexpensive, handy device. I'll post a link down below. It's called a 1-2-3 block. Machinists use it, and once you have them in your shop, you find multiple uses for them. Also, I'm using Starbond CA glue to hold this thing together. It was really quick to do. I've got the accelerator as well, and so it's a great way to quickly draft out a model. It's also a great glue for this sort of thing. If you don't reinforce the joint, you can still snap them if you need to, if you have to change something around, which I had to do a couple times. Believe it or not, the most intimidating part of this build for me was the tabletop, and more specifically the leaf system. It has pull-out leaves so that your knees don't knock up against the structure of the table. It's pretty important, and I really have never built anything like this before, and I didn't have good photo reference or even a knowledge of it. I was going off of some pictures, and I found one video online of this thing working, but I've not interacted with a table like this before. So I was kind of just guessing at it from the pictures that I saw. One of the things that I did was I notched out this apron so that it would sit down flush. That's something I could see from the photos, but the internal structure was just a pure mystery to me. So this is where the model comes in super handy, because I can take time at this stage and just cut a bunch of parts, see what works, see what doesn't. As you can see, there's a lot that doesn't work. The leaves don't really have a way to stop either internally or externally, and they also don't sit flush to the tabletop, which is a huge problem. So the first thing that was really easy to do was to make some sort of stop mechanism underneath the tabletop. I just used carpet tape because I wasn't confident that this was going to be a permanent solution, which it didn't end up being. And then I also added the offcut wedge back in from the bandsaw because this didn't end up making a lot of sense for it to have this little wedge section. I think I had seen that in a picture, but this worked better in my mind, so that's what I ended up going with. Putting it back together, it worked quite a bit better. I don't think I know I didn't solve all the problems here because you'll see in a little while some other things that crop up once it gets to full scale. But I did like how it was moving. I didn't like how those stop blocks were sticking out, and I definitely had to re-engineer that later on. Now, one thing that I knew is that the connection between the legs and the top had to be flexible in some way because I need to lift it up so that the leaves will actually slide in. I couldn't come up with a real good solution, so at this stage it was sort of for future Michael to deal with, and I just used a bit of blue tape.
This week's video is sponsored by Bespoke Post. Bespoke Post is a monthly membership club, and they pair you with these cool goods that are found in these little kits. I have 3 kits in front of me: the Carve kit, Copper kit, and the Weekender. I'm gonna open these up and show you what's inside. They do a great job of pairing the kits with the person. Based on a quiz that you take at the very beginning, they're gonna offer you a box every month. It's up to you to decide whether you want it or not. You can either keep it, trade it in for a different box, or skip that month entirely for absolutely no charge. 90% of the products in Bespoke Post boxes come from small businesses, many of which are right here in the United States. Every box has around $70 in value, but costs only $45. There's some really cool kits. I got the Scrimshaw kit, which I'm probably the most excited about. Oddly enough, Scrimshaw was the original name for Winston, but Ashley wouldn't approve that one. I've always wanted to learn how to Scrimshaw, and this kit gives me all the tools to figure it out. I've drawn a little picture of Winston. I'm gonna get into the Scrimshawing soon. I will post on Instagram the instant I finish this because I think it's gonna be amazing. To get 20% off your first box, visit the link in the description down below and use offer code MichaelAlm20 at checkout, or visit bspk.me/MichaelAlm20. I'm really happy with my new gear. Thanks, Bespoke Post, and let's get back to the build.
Now I can finally start in on the actual build. I was feeling a lot more confident after making the little model, and I'm gonna be making this as kind of a second prototype. I don't really expect this to be perfect, but I'm kind of honing in on it. I want this to be sort of at the level where I can live with it for a little while and see how I like it. Since I'm making this prototype out of Baltic birch plywood, I didn't see any reason to have to do joinery on the legs, so I just cut the legs out of a solid piece. It was super handy to have the model there. I used it a ton to take measurements, making sure that I was getting the heights just right, and all I had to do was triple all the measurements that I measured off the model, and then I could scale everything up. One of the big things to figure out was that track. Fortunately, I'd done most of the work on the model, and then I could go into Illustrator and build it out from there. So some of you out there probably already predicted that the way that I'm going to make this track is with the Shaper Origin. This is the CNC that I have in my shop. I don't have a good spot for a flatbed CNC, and I've been using Origin for a couple of years now, and it's so handy for this sort of operation where you don't really need to cut the entire thing out. In fact, it would be slower to cut this part out by a traditional CNC, but to make this track, you'd probably have to spend a lot of time making a jig, and then you'd have to dial in that jig, and if you made it wrong, you'd have to make it again. But Shaper Origin takes a lot of that guesswork out. You can see here that the track is too tight, which I was expecting. I made the tolerances really tight because the tool allows you to change the tolerances internally. So you can set an offset. In this case, I'm changing it to just 0.005 inches. And I forgot to make that negative. Negative will push it outward. And then I can just run that again. And it's going to remember that offset so that when I make the next cut, I don't have to set it again. If you haven't seen me use this tool before, or you're curious what the heck it does and how it works, I've got a full video on Shaper Origin if you want to check that out. I'll post a link right here, and it also covers how to make this jig that I'm using. It's a really simple jig that I use all the time. The tool uses something called shaper tape to find where it is in space. That's the dominoes that are sort of sitting out in front there, and it uses that as like visual markers so that it can track where the router bit is so that it can self-correct. The shaper tape is a disposable, but if you build jigs like this, you get to reuse the tape over and over again, and the machine actually saves that workspace internally so you don't have to even rescan it between uses. I like this jig a lot because it's really adaptable. The only thing that I do have to do is re-grid the section, and with their new update, their Inverness update, they allow you to mirror your parts internally, which is really cool that they continue to update the software so you have even more features. Same tool, more features. Pretty cool. With the legs more or less complete, I could start making the upright lift mechanism. I'm basically just building in the same order as I did the model. But for this, I've got to scale everything up. So rather than using a bandsaw, I'm using my table saw sled with a stop block. And once I establish the cheek cuts on it, I can remove that stop block and cut out the center. You'll notice that I'm using a backer board on this. Just was getting a lot of tear out with this plywood, and it helped a lot for that. So I marked out the center pivot point as well as the top pivot point and drilled these out using a 1/2 inch Forstner bit. And then went over to my bench sander and sanded the corners so that they were round. This just makes sure that it doesn't bind underneath the table as it's moving. So here's a little trick for cutting dowels. I don't like to put a fence or a stop block on my bandsaw when I cut these because they tend to bind up. So I just put a little tape on the surface, and then I like to rotate through the cut. That rotation, for some reason, results in a perfectly square dowel. I'm not sure the geometry on that, but it does work. These stretchers on the table are going to be doing quite a bit of work, especially the ones that interlock with the lifting assembly, and so I decided to go with dominoes for those. The center stretcher is really, it's just could barely fit in there. I actually had to shave it down a little bit, make it smaller than the other two, just to get it to not interact with the leg lift assembly as it slides in. I think when I design a second version, the final version of this table, I'll probably widen the table a little bit so I have a little bit more room. And speaking of making more room, every little bit counts on this table, and this little block is a jig so that I can drill out a half hole so that when the dowels for the lifting mechanism come down, they can actually sit a little bit lower on the table. This table is a balancing act of heights and strengths and stability, just trying to get that extra little, what would be 3/8 of an inch lower, is honestly really important because dining room tables are very specific height to match your chairs, and coffee tables are very specific height to match your couch. So if I don't get that, it's kind of a problem. So the way this little block works is I drilled out the two as they were screwed together, and then I could unscrew one, cut it in half, and then screw the block back together again. And then I have a little drill guide. I can clamp that drill guide onto the edge of a piece and then drill through, and the hole should be a perfect half hole in that element. For this, I'm just aligning it with the track below it because I want the leg to be perfectly square and perpendicular to the stretcher, and then I just ease over the corners because I want it to slide really naturally into that notch. At this point, I was about ready to assemble things with glue and everything, so I did my roundovers and cleaned everything up, gave it a quick sand, and I was ready for a glue up. For the lift mechanism, I also needed a couple of stretchers, and the only difference between these and other stretchers is they need to be removable in some way. I settled on the easy choice of using pocket hole screws. I would love to figure out a different mechanical connection that I could use in these. If you got suggestions, leave them in the comments down below. But for a prototype, this was ideal. I can remove these as I need to if I need to get back in and work on something. And I'm hoping that the final version will have an accessible way to do this as well. After that, I started working on the apron, and this is right off of the model, built exactly the same way. What I did was I measured out halfway down and then 5 inches back and did a little taper on it just to make it look a little bit nicer. I also went over to the drill press and drilled out the pivot holes for the 1/2 inch dowels. It works! I lifted it up and down several times just to see how the movement worked and if there were any issues. There's a couple odds and ends that I think I can improve on, but for the most part, it worked really well. With the base basically complete, I can start working on the tabletop and the leaf mechanism. This is the tapered sections for the leaves. I just taped 3 of these together and cut them on the diagonal, and that will yield 6 of them, which I can then tape those together and cut the front edge off so that they've got kind of that blunt nose. The parts were a little rough from the bandsaw, so I figured I'd spend a little bit of time and sand them out. So I'm going to be drilling through the edge grain of this plywood. Whenever I do that, I prefer to use a pan head screw, not something with a wedge. And I also like to drill a flat spot in. The best way to do that is with a Forstner bit. I set the depth stop on this drill press so that all the screws will actually end up being the same height, even though they're drilled into an angled piece of wood. After that, I can go over those holes one more time with a regular drill bit and pilot them out. Up until this point, I have only used one sheet of plywood. I'm breaking into the second sheet of plywood. These are 5x5 sheets of 3/4 inch Baltic birch. And I'm gonna be cutting the tabletop out of this and the leaves to match. I'm doing grain matching, although this piece of Baltic birch was so similar all the way across, you probably couldn't tell. And then I round over the edges real quick with a router bit. The tapered pieces for the leaves are pretty critical to get aligned correctly, just because they're going to be sliding in and out. You don't want them to bind up, and so I took a lot of time just to make sure that these were nice and square all the way across. Incidentally, I'm actually using the same screws that I used for my pocket hole jig. They were exactly the right size. I thought I was going to have to go out and buy specialty screws, but they turned out to be perfect. So once I've got this thing centered and set on the apron of the table, I can mark out where it's going to go. I need to notch these out once again, and they're going to have to be notched out at a bit of an angle, but I think before doing that, it makes more sense to hog out a majority of the material on the table saw. Both of the aprons are taped together here, and so I'm cutting through on both sides so that they'll match up perfectly, and I don't have to cut them twice. I'm also, I'm just eyeballing this, but being pretty cautious. I'm erring on the side of undercutting them so that when I take it over to the actual piece, I can test fit it. And good thing I did that. It was a little bit tight on the first trial, and I was just able to shave off a little bit extra on one side, and that managed to get it to slide well. To match the angle of the taper, I measured out the leaf and then transferred that mark over to the apron. And it seemed easy enough just to go for this with hand tools. It was pretty quick to chisel out. I used a Japanese pole saw to score the section just so that I could follow a line while I was going through and make sure not to cut out too much material. And as is the case with everything, the first one was okay, the sixth one was perfect, and that's why I'm calling this a prototype. Now we're going off the model. It's basically at this point where I've made everything that I designed on the model, and now I have to engineer stuff again. Fortunately, I've had a couple restless nights sleep thinking about how to design this table, and what I came up with in the middle of the night was this little T-shaped deal. This is going to act as the apron rail sort of cross support, sort of the stretcher on the apron rail, and it's also going to add a stop for the leaves, and it's going to be the connection between the apron rail and the tabletop. I'm securing it with dominoes. Once again, that was the sort of the only thing that would fit in here, and fortunately it just was just wide enough for a domino. You can start to see how this works. So the T section is actually going to be high enough to sit inside of the tabletop, and I can screw down through those holes that I drilled out with the drill press and secure it with what I plan to be a loose connection. And at first it looked like it would be super promising. You can see how it lifts up on one side just enough so that the leaf can slide out. But I quickly discovered that once both leaves were down, there was a serious rock back and forth.
Well, that's not good.
What I realized happened is that when I scaled up the angles for the leaves, I probably just didn't scale them up right, because the leaves were so small on the model that any sort of discrepancy caused a pretty big problem. It took me a little while to figure out what I was going to do, but in the meantime, I decided to just try securing the tabletop and seeing how that was performing. I mean, it did all right for the first try, but there were definitely some design issues that I needed to resolve. The main thing is that when it's out and fully extended, when you press down, that loose connection lifts the tabletop. I need to solve for that as well. These are just things that I didn't figure out when I was building the model, because it was too small and it doesn't really have the weight that the tabletop does. So I came up with a couple ideas. At first, I considered remaking the wedges, but in the spirit of this being a prototype, I felt like that was just too much time to invest. So instead of doing that, I found some thin strips of oak that I already had milled up and just cut them to size. I ended up rounding over the front edge of them so that it would ease that transition as the leaves slide into place. This is not a perfect solution, but it's enough to get the job done so that I can see if this table works at all. I also made some removable stoppers on the inside out of some oak and a furniture pad and some screws. This is just going to prevent the leaf from being able to pull out too far. Okay. There's still one issue to solve, and that was the lifting up of the tabletop. Because of that loose connection, when you put pressure on the front edge of the leaves, it lifts up the tabletop. I decided to go with something simple. I looked around my hardware to see if I could find some sort of pre-made latch. I found these boat cleats, which were honestly perfect. I traced out some marks on the apron rail, and then I could remove the whole apron assembly and route out a channel for that lock to sink into. I, of course, have to thank my Instagram followers for helping me come to these solutions. I put out a questionnaire on Instagram, and loads of people answered that, and it got my mind moving again when I was like, I don't know how I'm going to solve these problems. So thanks, everybody on there for helping me out. The last thing to do on the table is to wax everything, put everything back together, and see if the whole thing works.
I mean, come on. I love this thing. This was so much work, and I've been putting in long hours just to get it done. But the satisfaction of this thing working is it's just hard to explain. There are a few things that I changed. The main thing is that I added a couple dominoes here as a stop. I was having trouble with it hyperextending, which was really freaky, and the whole weight of it would come forward, and then it felt like parts were going to snap off of it. So just putting a couple dominoes in here worked. In the original table, they just had a longer finger here, but long story short, I didn't have enough room on the inside here to do that, so I also didn't want to rebuild the whole leg. But the vast majority of this thing works incredibly well. The latching mechanism is fantastic and super simple. And yeah, let me know if you want to see me build this again. Please, I'm waiting on your comments to let me know to continue this pursuit. Because I do think that I can improve several things and build a set of plans for it, because I imagine somebody else needs one of these in their home. Thank you for watching. Thanks to Bespoke Post, and thank you to my Patreon supporters. You guys are the best, and I'll catch you on the next one. Bye.